Thank you for coming this evening. On behalf of the Centre for Global Research, I'd like to welcome you all to this month's Global Friction Seminar. I'm Vandra Harris and I am the Discipline Leader for Global Studies here at RMIT. And as well as convening the discussion panel this evening, I lead Global Studies discipline and I'm a member of the Centre for Global Research Executive. So it's an absolute pleasure to be able to bring this group of people together for such a well-attended event. This is our 4th seminar for this year and the series has been incredibly successful, and tonight we do have a record-breaking audience. We've had to move out of our usual venue into this venue and that's a real delight. Tonight's topic is the humanitarian field a complete disaster? And it brings together some key leaders in our own centre along with partners from outside the university, which is an important part of what we do as a research centre. Before I introduce our panel members, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the university stands. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and I respectfully recognise and welcome here tonight elders both past, present and emerging. I'm going to introduce the panel very briefly this evening because they all have so many stars by their names that I could just spend the whole evening introducing them. And I have to tell the truth and say that this really for me was a great excuse to have all of my favourite people in the room. They will this evening speak for about 7 minutes each. I've asked them to tell a story which for them is representative of the state of the humanitarian sector and explain why. And I have promised them some tricky questions myself if they don't take the 7 minutes, so I'm pretty sure they'll all take the 7 minutes. So this evening we have Beth Eccleston from the Humanitarian Advisory Group, Natalie McCauley from Child Safe Horizons, Emma Kettle from RedR Australia, and Ian Cruikshank from Knowledge Management Solutions for Development. And with no further ado, I'll hand over to Beth.
Hello. Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank you very much Vandra and the Centre for Global Research for organising this really interesting, well I'm sure it'll be really very fascinating panel discussion tonight. I also echo Vandra, it's lovely to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues, so lovely to see you all. Special shout out to the master students that we've been teaching this week. Can I have a little wave? Are they? Yeah, VIPs all. So my name's Beth Eccleston and I'm a founder and co-director of Humanitarian Advisory Group, a social enterprise based here in Melbourne. I'm going to tell you of a little story and of some of my thoughts for what they're worth about the humanitarian sector as it stands today. So during the 3 years that I worked in Afghanistan, I became very close to one particular family whose story is too horrific to recount. And sadly, it is not unique. We've remained very close over the past decade. They've made it to Turkey, where they're claiming asylum, and it's there that I went to visit them last year. While spending several days being showered with famous Afghan hospitality by my friends who couldn't really afford it, I noticed in the corner of one room a line of shopping bags filled with nappies, tin food, toiletries, and a range of other household items. For the first couple of days, I didn't ask, but before I left, I did inquire about these supplies. My friend Manisha replied, "Oh, they're for the recent arrivals in our neighbourhood from Syria. They're really having a hard time. They really have nothing." And I thought how much we underestimate the capacity of affected populations to survive, to provide, and to endure. So that's what's happening at the community level. At the global level, we are focused on a range of initiatives that will hopefully provide answers to questions that are not yet fully defined. The focus on innovation, inclusion, localisation, futures, cash-based programming, coalitions, hackathons, and humanitarian blockchain can sometimes make us feel further away from the communities we seek to assist, whilst being fantastically interesting in their approach. I recently watched a TED Talk by David Miliband, the president of the International Rescue Committee, one of the big 5 mega NGOs. He went really back to basics in his articulation of our duty to strangers. He said that the humanitarian situation worldwide is a test of our humanity and of our character. And I would add to that our ingenuity and our political will. We said never again. We are seeing the red line being exceeded, thresholds crossed, and sanctions flouted. 2 aspects I feel that are important and that influence humanitarian action, or the lack of it, are risk and trust. Perhaps 2 sides of the same coin. At the World Humanitarian Summit, the Grand Bargain was launched, which, among other things, committed many major donors and international NGOs to give 25% of all humanitarian funding to national actors by the year 2020. So at the moment we have $15 billion aid budget, and only 2% of that goes to local actors. So how is this going to change without increasing their risk for appetite and acceptance of losses? Funding for international actors and the reporting this entails is complex enough. The Norwegian Refugee Council and the Boston Consulting Group have recently released a report which finds that whilst reporting requirements are crucial, they are deeply problematic. For NGOs that receive support from multiple entities, the patchwork cost of cost definitions and formats may consume more than 1 million hours a year. And of course, time spent on paperwork is time unavailable to directly serve people in need. This acceptance of risk also encompasses the realities of working in hostile environments. For example, when rebels looted an NRC office in South Sudan, killing a staff member and stealing $13,000 worth of equipment and supplies, the NRC had to repay $13,000 to the donor to cover the property losses, under the rule of zero tolerance for corruption, irregularities, or both. Such rules may pressure NGOs to make avoiding risk, rather than reaching the most vulnerable populations in a humanitarian crisis, the primary consideration. On trust, I constantly see a system that involves decision-making devoid of people whom the decision impacts. When I have raised this concern, I am consistently given the same rebuke. These people have agendas. This is often the excuse given for diaspora groups not being involved in humanitarian programs. How do we think that we don't have agendas and others do? This baffles me. The lack of trust undermines so much of our approach. Perhaps there is a transformation that needs to happen. It's not that we are asking the wrong questions, it's that the wrong people are doing the asking. How do we get the right people into our universities, our NGOs, our systems? Or perhaps it's our very institutions that are part of the problem. Are we hearing the voices who can actually ask with authority? This lack of trust extends to the relationships between government donors and NGOs. A relationship, in my opinion, in Australia anyway, has a long way to maturity. We've spent so much time talking about non-traditional actors and new and emerging donors that we've forgotten some of the very traditional challenges, like political will to end and prevent conflict, on stopping nuclear weapons and upholding international humanitarian law. Although I've learnt that innovation and technology, drones and design thinking can only get us so far, I recently saw a picture in an ICRC report of a man's face glowing in the darkness on the shores of Lesbos in Greece as he searches for a mobile signal to check his location and notify relatives that they arrive safely. He is one of those strangers to whom we have a duty, and we must not fail. Thank you.
Now I just want to have a conversation about what you said. You raised a lot of things. My background's child protection, so I've been in child protection for over 20 years now, and my lens on this is through that, originally coming from social work. And what I was thinking are we trauma-informed in the humanitarian sector? Do we even put a lens of trauma around what we're actually looking at? And are we being evidence-based if we're not trauma-informed? So if we look at brain development, for example, 90% of the brain is developed in utero up to the age of 4. How many of our programs are looking at pregnant women or lactating mothers or children under the age of 4 or even to 5? I would say a very small percentage. No one's even really doing that analysis. There's a very small sector called early childhood development, which is outside of the child protection sector in humanitarian field, which seems ludicrous to me as well. And the child protection field has to fight for every single second and cent that it actually gets right now. The next 10% of our brain is developed in adolescence up to the age of 24. How many of our programs are targeting that group? Now, we sometimes have youth clubs in a humanitarian response, but rarely do we look at high school education or accelerated learning projects, particularly in an emergency response. In development sector, we do, but that sector is seen as very different to the humanitarian response sector, which when I was doing my study, I didn't actually realise. Initially, when I went overseas 17 years ago, I was very much in the development sector. I was dealing with trafficking in children and case management in slums in Bangkok. And then I went into emergencies, and then you become an emergency junkie. You go back to back, back to back, back to back. And you are now seen as an emergency expert rather than a development expert. And you'll see in offices when you go to these locations that the development people are seen as separate even when an emergency hits. These are the people that are on the ground and know the information on the ground, know the partners. Emergency people are flying in, or they might be just the sole emergency person in that office that has to manage things, but they don't necessarily have all those relationships. So are we actually being evidence-based? Are we actually being trauma-informed? We know that traumatic events impact our brains, and we particularly know that it impacts the way we respond to challenging situations and to lifelong responses if it happens at a young age. So imagine the impact of ongoing trauma on a child, particularly a child under the age of 5, where 90% of your brain is developed. If all you've known is traumatic events and your family, particularly the people that are caring for you, are living in that sort of stress, will you have the attachment and attunement that you would need to get proper brain development? Now, most people in the humanitarian sector don't even know what attachment and attunement is. Again, seems ridiculous to me because all of the sectors should be mainstreaming this type of response because it's actually going to have a long-term impact on the communities in which we're meant to be serving. We show this, that, you know, child protection is not important because we in the humanitarian sector prioritise major sectors like health and WASH, and they get the biggest chunk of the cash. And sometimes, if we're lucky, education might get the first wave, maybe, if they can fight to say that they're life-saving. And often child protection is the one standing in the corner of the room saying children will die if you don't give us money. We look like the crazy ones. Not quite often we are. But really, in Australian community, for example, we would never have to argue that a child protection system is relevant or important. Imagine in this environment, in Melbourne, if we suddenly said, we don't need a child protection system, or there's no child protection system to respond. What would that mean for the children in Victoria, for example, or across Australia? This would never happen here, of course, but this is often what we are faced with when we turn up into an emergency, where the development sector also is not necessarily having, child protection is not having a big chunk of the pie, or they're being thematic based in that they're going for the cash grabs like street children or child soldiers, not necessarily looking at it as a systemic approach. And so quite often in emergencies I've found that systems building is not considered, and certainly not child protection. And it's certainly not considered as a priority by our colleagues. We've had to fight for space over the last 10 years and we're still fighting for that space, absolutely. I wanted to just tell you a quick story about when I was in South Kordofan and I was leading the child protection response at that time. And in Sudan, they give the Common Humanitarian Fund, which is basically a bucket of cash, and at the national level, the humanitarian country team decides how much each state is going to get of that bucket of cash. And South Kordofan had been given a few $1 million. And so all of the coordinators were sitting around this one table. I was the only woman in the room. And I happened to go to the toilet. There was a Flipchart piece of paper with all the different sectors and the prices and the cash that each sector was going to get. And we'd been negotiating for hours, and I absolutely had to go to the loo. Happens, right? Thinking they're not going to touch anything while I go to the loo. Went to the loo and I came back and we'd lost $500,000. This is the sort of thing that goes on in the humanitarian sector. You think we've got all these big words that Beth was sprouting, innovation and, rights-based and all of this sort of stuff. But when it comes down to it, you've got a group of people that are highly strung, been in many emergencies, don't know how to communicate with each other or themselves. And then they're all got a Flipchart piece of paper deciding if children are going to live or die. With no evidence, no data on how many. We'll make it fit afterwards. So you have a piece of the pie and then you make the language fit it afterwards. That's not evidence-based. That's not the only time that has happened. It's the only time it's happened when I've gone to the loo, but it's not the only time that it's actually happened, where we've sat around with a Flipchart piece of paper and you've got WASH, which is a given. They definitely get the biggest chunk. Health is a given. Nutrition is a given, and then the rest of us are all scrambling for pieces of the cash. So again, I want to come back to, are we trauma-informed? And even in child protection, are we trauma-informed? So when we're focusing on the end response, when we're focusing on what happens after a traumatic event, rather than focusing on, okay, I talk a lot. Vandra already knows this. I'm probably going to take more than 7 minutes. Can't help myself. I'll do my best. So if we're focusing just on the end response, if we're focusing on counselling or psychosocial support at the end result, rather than looking at building systems in an emergency response and focusing in on the brain development component, the under fives, the adolescents, are we being trauma-informed even in child protection? The answer probably is no. So if we can't even do it in child protection or in the areas where we should know about this stuff, how are we going to do it across the whole of the humanitarian sector? What I wanted to think about too, just before I finish, was around the people in the room with the Flipchart. And I know for myself at that stage, I'd been kidnapped in Myanmar, I'd been arrested in Darfur, sent to South Kordofan. And I know that myself, I hadn't had any support or any help. I currently do some work for an organisation called Humanitarian Wellbeing, and over 80% of females in the humanitarian sector have actually, have actually been sexually assaulted or had some sort of sexual innuendo that has affected them. And yet we don't have a response for that. So where are the people at that table? Where are they in their brain? And they're down in the base of their brain, which is in survival mode. It's fight, flight, freeze. Can we actually develop an effective evidence-based response if we're all suffering from vicarious trauma and if our organisations aren't looking after us? In my experience, the response in a humanitarian sector is effective when relationships are effective. And it's based on personalities. And it's based on whether those personalities can tolerate each other, create empathy with each other, and get along. Pretty much like a family. You don't have a choice who you're in an emergency with, and you have to get along. If they get along, and if they can work together, then you will have an effective response. If you can't, then you're going to have less of an effective response and less results for children, particularly from my perspective. So I want us to think about trauma from two perspectives, one for programming, but also us as a sector, as human beings. Is the humanitarian sector a complete disaster? Yes and no, but not completely. Definitely not. And I think that we get too many wins, we help too many people for it to be seen as a complete disaster. We work in disasters, so there's got to be an element of that in there. But how do we manage that? And I think it can be much better if we look through the lens of trauma-informed programming.
Yes, WASH, for those who don't know, water and sanitary hygiene, or sometimes, that's okay, or sometimes water and sanitary hygiene education will be added onto the end. Before I focus on my two areas, I'd just like to pick up on two streams. Risk and trust, I think, are fundamental to what I'm going to be talking about, but I would certainly echo what Natalie said about if you're not one of the life-saving sectors. So I have lost count of the number of times somebody has said to me, education in emergencies is my particular area of interest. Yeah, we're busy saving lives and you want money to put kids back into school. And this is not donors, this is not political leaders, this is WASH experts, nutrition experts, shelter experts. So even as a sector, we are still not fully appraising the contribution that each of the technical sectors gives and the value of having child protection mainstreaming across all of those sectors and things like that. So it is a massive factor, and certainly in terms of funding we are scrabbling for the little pieces of the pie, despite significant evidence and research and literature that shows that adequate funding and attention to those critical areas has a significant impact on the big life-saving agencies. Anyway, that wasn't actually what I was going to talk about, but it is relevant.
And we're considered as not as life-saving.
Not as life-saving.
As health and more.
Yes, as health more. So it's an ongoing, you can tell we've had to fight this fight for many, many years. I actually wanted to talk a little bit about, and it's also to do with preparedness, as about how do we adequately prepare people to work in the sector. It's an area of particular interest to me. My background is teaching and teacher training, and we focus very heavily on technical competence. As an organisation that has a standby roster, we require people obviously to be technically qualified and to have significant field experience. However, historically we've cared less, I don't mean my organisation, but the sector has cared less about the whole person. Does that person have really strong interpersonal skills? Can they demonstrate leadership and different models of leadership according to the requirements of the context that they're working in? Do they demonstrate high levels of self-awareness? Do they demonstrate resilience, a key attribute for somebody working in rapidly moving and changing, challenging contexts? And do they have adequate mental and physical health to be able to withstand the rigors of what can be extremely fatiguing, physically and mentally challenging roles? A particular area of interest of mine is cultural competence. And anecdotally at least, and with some sort of very small amounts of research, we get feedback again and again that the reason assignments and humanitarian assignments are less than successful or not totally successful is not because of technical inability or technical shortfalls, or we didn't have the right equipment, or we didn't have the right nutrition packs. It's been about team dysfunction. And it's, for me, why are the institutions that are required to pull together and coordinate and develop programming not addressing these shortfalls in leadership, managing bad managers out, addressing the strong HR issues? So that brings me to the idea of, are the institutions themselves fit for purpose? And so if we look at the agencies that are feeding into these coordination mechanisms that are making nutrition speak to WASH and speak to shelter and hopefully speak to education in emergencies and child protection as well, if they're predominantly under the care or duty of a United Nations agency, to what extent are those agencies, which are now, if I'm being kind, mature, if I'm being less kind, maybe long in the tooth, are they still fit for purpose? Many of them are decades and decades old now. They have not had to operate in a system of commercial competition. Therefore, their evolution and survival has relied on the fact that they are the UN, they are the World Food Programme. Who's going to come up against that? And therefore, who is holding them accountable in terms of them really having their duty of care at the top towards the disaster-affected community. And to me, second after that is the wider community around that disaster. You know, in the wider community, say, so, you know, with TC-PAM, you had obviously the disaster-affected community affected by the typhoon, but then the wider community of the Pacific and Vanuatu. And then that duty of care to colleagues, that their mental and physical well-being is being addressed. And then the responsibility to donors, obviously in politics. Where does the agency sit in that? And my story is actually about Ebola. I was deployed into WHO during the Ebola response. And I was tasked with what I foolishly thought was a fairly straightforward, I had 3 months to prepare pre-deployment training for 100,000 epidemiologists coming from all over the world into the West African affected countries, 3 affected countries. And a colleague said to me, somebody who I'd previously worked with in Australia, how long would it usually take you to prepare this kind of package? And I said, oh, if they've got all of the materials, and because of my background, oh, maybe, you know, 2 to 3 weeks of drafting, and then we'll go through a process of approval. So, you know, maybe 10, 11 weeks. And they just laughed out loud, and they said 6 months. It's going to take you 6 months. Yeah, right, I'm only here for 3, so let's see what we get done. And I found very, very quickly that the institution, the WHO, which was the coordinating agency, with UNMIA, which was the United Nations mechanism for the Ebola response, as a public health institution formed with the direct purpose to provide global health advice and research around global outbreaks and health issues, was not adequately prepared to run a major health emergency. That's not what it was set up for. And so I faced this challenge throughout where I wanted to provide training on cultural effectiveness. They wanted 3 pages on the strain of the virus. And so the focus was always back on the technical, where my experience told me that the epidemiologists who'd never been to Africa before, they already were trained as epidemiologists. They already knew all about Ebola. They may not have worked on Ebola, but they had worked significantly with contagious diseases and things like that. They wanted to know if there were ATMs in Sierra Leone. They wanted to know if it was going to be safe to go out at night. They wanted to know how team structures would work. They wanted to know whether the management systems in Guinea were largely hierarchical or flatline. So there was a challenge for me to make the institution to whom I was responsible understand the needs of the people who were going to be going out into the field. And if I'm honest, I failed, because I got sucked into a system where I couldn't fight. I couldn't fight WHO alone. And it was not seen to be of high enough priority, but there was no space for me to be listened to. And so my specific story to tell you how entrenched that became and how each institution was so intent on being right was we had to write a lot of, produce a lot of diagrammatic resources, because obviously we're working across multiple countries with different language capabilities and things. And 3 of the key partners were WHO, the World Health Organization, MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and CDC, the Center for Disease Control based out of the States. And the most important and urgent information to get out there was about PPE, you know, the protective gear that people wear. And the most important part of the process of donning PPE and doffing PPE was after people had been in touch, obviously, with people who'd been affected by Ebola. Now, MSF, the way that MSF did this, I'm going to have to put my microphone down. Can you just hold that for me? So MSF, the rule was that if you had your goggles on, because the goggles are the last thing you do, you pulled the goggles away from your head, because they're on elastic, like that. You do that so that the goggles slipped off and you drop them to the ground. Okay, really simple. WHO, because of drippage, WHO said that you put your head forward, you put the goggles down, you slip it off your head. 2 days. 2 days in a room trying to get WHO and MSF to agree on one picture, because we're trying to do flip books here, which are going to go, like the Red Cross National Society is going to be taking round on mopeds to do local, couldn't get them to agree, because neither of them was prepared to shift on their expert opinion. So I actually left with quite a cynical view of the ability of these big agencies to learn, to be prepared to compromise, and it really has left the question for me about fit for purpose. Now, I have to caveat this by saying there is no doubt that the World Health Organization, in many respects, does phenomenal work. There was a measles campaign just over 2 years ago in the Middle East, 23 million children vaccinated in 3 months. Phenomenal outcomes. But does that mean that the institutions who are accountable and responsible for coordinating humanitarian emergencies are actually the right institutions? Maybe it's not the mechanisms that are at fault, that have $500,000 going out of the window when Nat goes to the loo. Maybe it's actually the institutions behind them. And if we do not find a way to make those institutions accountable, then I begin to lose heart that our ability to respond more effectively and efficiently and have that duty of care to disaster-affected people, whether we're actually going to get any better at it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ian Cruikshank. I'm a few months short of 40 years in the Australian Army. I'm now a reservist, long time in the regular Army, served twice for the UN, served in Lebanon, Golan Heights, Malaysia, Iraq twice, Afghanistan, East Timor, and a couple other small places. I don't have a story to tell, I have an observation to tell, and I'm going to annoy the lady to my left, because I'm going to use the word innovation and innovative possibly a couple of times.
We'll do some debrief.
There'll be some good stories later on, but it'll be at the pub when I'm allowed to tell them. So driving to work early last year, I thought to myself, we may have stumbled upon the start of World War III. I got to work, got out an A3 sheet of paper and scribbled down all of the threats, the challenges and the issues that beset the world, as at the start of last year. I came up with a number of trends, none of which I hope will be new to you. The increasing threat posed by terrorism and extremism, chronic continued conflict in countries, unresolved global tensions which are getting worse, the increase in natural disasters linked to climate change, cyber threats, think about just recently, emerging expansionist powers, particularly in our region, globalisation, projecting economic, social and political activities across frontiers. Then we have the outriders, those 3 or 4 men with really bad hairstyles, wear bad suits and some ride bears. They are to me as equally dangerous as is the connection of any one of the above events I've just spoken about. So the very topic of this panel suggests that the humanitarian field is a complete disaster. If we add R2P, humanitarian intervention, the complexities of hybrid or ambiguous warfare, and the post-factum reaction to natural disasters, the world's in a bit of a mess. Personally, I believe that humanitarianism will survive. There are many altruistic people out there who will ensure it does. But I think for it to evolve, to remain innovative, and the need for cooperation is vital. I propose that a concentrated, dedicated effort to form partnerships between the military, multi-agencies, and most importantly, local partners within our sphere of influence is required. Now, this approach needs to be integrated, needs to be adaptive, and it needs to see the local partners at the forefront of what we are doing in the humanitarian practice, because they already have the relationships and they understand the space that they live in. So what can the humanitarian sector take from the military? Our processes, our structures, our capabilities. Could we or should we assume command of humanitarian responses? Can we command the humanitarian response, and can we coordinate the coordinators? A few eyebrows being raised up here, that's for sure. I'll touch on 5 areas what I think that you might consider as humanitarians under the theme innovative partnerships. First of all, we need to really strengthen our coordination between the military and civil agencies, okay? particularly in the Pacific region, and with parts, particularly in the Pacific region and parts of South America, which are projected by 2030 to have the greatest majority of natural disasters in the world. Okay? Armed forces in the region are becoming increasingly involved in planning for disaster relief and humanitarian assistance events. We work bilaterally and unilaterally within the region. And that can't be a bad thing. But I just want to stress, though, you need to understand that military commanders do understand that they are in a supporting role, but they really understand the importance of relationships and those relationships which are cooperative. The second is planning. Military planners are slick. They are very good at what they do and they are very professional. However, they don't necessarily understand all that is required in a humanitarian event or a disaster relief event. So they need to talk to and understand the roles of humanitarians. They need to do this to understand the humanitarian priorities, the exit strategies, and to coordinate effectively with the affected state. This leads then to my third point, proactive engagement and collaborative training. Now, this engagement must occur before an event. It needs to be dedicated, continual, and it needs to be interactive between the military and multi-agencies. Training with each other results in a better understanding of capabilities, of processes, language, which is very important, particularly with the military, and resultantly confidence in each other's abilities builds. Importantly, as I've mentioned before, the military can plan and effectively deploy very quickly. But the planning processes really need the input from humanitarian personnel and agencies because, quite frankly, you are often better at defining second and third order effects on the civilian population in a humanitarian event. My fourth point then is building habitual relationships. This may seem like a sotbo, a statement of the blinding obvious, but ongoing engagement, training participation in national and multinational training events builds habitual relationships. Accordingly, these relationships break down barriers, builds trust and understanding between partners. I'd like to say that the effective DFAT ADF response to Cyclone Winston last year was largely in part because a small group of people had worked together on exercises leading up to the deployment to Vanuatu and then later into Fiji. In other words, they understood each other, they had worked with each other, and they trusted each other. My last point is military capabilities. Apart from the ability to immediately deploy ships, aircraft, men, stores provided by government overseas very rapidly, the military is very good at command and control. And our command and control mechanisms are supported by technology. Now, it's largely this state of technology and the comprehensive preparedness planning that goes on within most militaries that facilitates this command and control in a situation like this, along with sophisticated communications, excellent aerial mapping facilities, interaction with the local populace, often the local military, and our ability to gain and garner information and then translate that into assistance to the civilian agencies. Now, when coupled with multi-agency organisations, local partners and regional disaster management organisations, this affords a very collaborative, is that tautology? I guess it could be, in which to discuss, to plan, conduct and direct interagency results. Remember, we're not directing, we're assisting the direction of. This directly relates to the coordination of effort in support of local partners, the distribution of aid rapidly, the provision of assistance and movement of humanitarian personnel, and largely that assistance to the affected population and the achievement of agreed outcomes for exit strategies and recovery. And ladies and gentlemen, before I get kicked in the leg, while not providing the panacea for the future of humanitarianism, the need for partnership innovation is especially critical between the military and the civilian cooperation space. This relationship is driven by necessity. I suggest that if the military and the civilian personnel and agencies enhance their understanding of each other, work better, more collaboratively, build habitual relationships, concurrent with reminding ourselves of the primacy of local humanitarian actors, new possibilities for humanitarian action may emerge. Thank you.
Thank you to all four of you. I can see each of you itching to respond to each other, but first of all, what I would like to do is invite Phil Connors from the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership at Deakin University to speak to us. I've invited Phil to act as a bit of a discussant on the speakers and to take the opportunity to speak to us about some very exciting new research in this area. So thank you, Phil.
Just let me get it set up here. Thank you, Vandra, and thank you for most interesting speakers. It's been fantastic, and some of my favourite people up here as well. I have been asked to speak, and Vandra invited me along because the research that we're talking about is not done by the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership, although we are involved in some interesting research with HAG and so forth. But it is from the Interagency Regional Analyst Network, IRAN, or YARAN as it's known. And they are the only, now they call themselves the only strategic planning tool for NGOs that looks 1 to 15 years ahead. And if we're looking at this question, is the humanitarian field a complete disaster zone? My initial reaction to that would be, in some ways I wish it were, because it might provide more opportunities for change. I think it's not, as it was pointed out, it's not at that stage where it is all breaking apart. It is strained at the seams, but it is trying to struggle through. What Yaran is talking about, and it's a report that it hasn't yet been released. It is actually being released in London on the 20th, so next Thursday in London. And the report is The Future of Aid, NGOs in 2030. The argument from Yaran is that we need strategic foresight. And what I heard from each of the speakers here was that the need to have more foresight, to be thinking further ahead, be less reactionary, less trying to deal with innovation in the moment. Why not deal with innovation by having a strategic view of what might be happening 10 or 15 years down the track? Part of that is going to be understanding the global mindset. We look at it currently, we have a move towards, and it was mentioned before, we're moving towards an insular view politically. Arguably, globally, there is probably the worst situation that we have encountered since the beginnings of the current humanitarian system. If we look at the current humanitarian system as existing since World War II. So that's when lots of these systems were set up, the UN, all of the different protocols and all of those sorts of things were set up at that time. Since then, this is arguably one of the worst political times we've got. We have, for instance, 65 million displaced people around the world. There hasn't been that sort of displacement since the Second World War, and some are even saying that we have more people displaced now than at the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, politically though, there was a feeling of wanting to look forward, look to the future, being optimistic about it was. Henceforth, you had global organisations like the UN set up with that view in mind. These days, if we were in that situation and we were trying to deal with that, the UN would probably never be set up. People would be saying, no, I want to pull back, I don't want to engage. Word globalisation was used. That is now currently under threat. Economic globalisation, I might agree, should be under threat. The act of globalisation within a humanitarian space, I disagree. Should be taken out. So Yaron is talking about, provides the report, looks at four different scenarios that could come about by 2030, and then provides and takes into account some assumptions. So the overview, just quickly, that the scenarios represent four distinct possible futures and the implications for NGOs. The key uncertainties that shape them revolve around nationalism and global governance, network companies, megacities, citizen movements, humanitarian principles, large-scale forced migration, and confessional NGOs. Two assumptions that are made within that. First assumption is that sudden onset natural hazards such as earthquakes and tsunamis will not change the way the humanitarian system operates. It will only increase what it's currently doing. The second assumption is that the UN system will not reform in order to expand its role of global governance. That notion of not reforming stems from the idea of if you are pushing for change, you are going to get resistance. The system is the system because people benefit from the current system. If there wasn't a benefit for those people in the system, it would have changed a long time ago. So that notion to resistance to change is embedded within the current system. So going back to my original comment, if it was a complete disaster zone, the system would have broken down, therefore it would have been considered broken, therefore the opportunities for change might be more meaningful. Given those assumptions, and from that overview, the report outlines four possible scenarios: the narrow gate approach, an overflow, so the narrow gate approach, protracted localised crises, crises becoming more politicised, rising preference for national and local aid, and we talked about the whole localisation process that was going on here, involuntary migration increasing, those sorts of issues. Implications for NGOs being control and restrictions, increased mistrust towards INGOs, because if you have a more nationalised response, INGOs are going to be more threatened and lose control. An overflow, characteristics, resurgence of a sovereignty and withdrawal of global governance, lack of transnational solutions, becoming more localised again. Migration increasing, flows of migrants have serious repercussions, particularly on host countries, and in the West, migrants continue to arrive, further contributing to the rise of radicalism and extremism, as was mentioned by Ian. Implications for NGOs under the overflow effect is that possibly the worst case scenario for INGOs, because access and principles are compromised. INGOs will have limited experience in managing regional responses. Funds will be transferred directly to local NGOs, probably not a bad thing, local NGOs and militaries, and global development assistance is not seen as a priority. So that whole insular notion within politics. Third one is each playing to the field. Much the same sorts of issues happening. New humanitarian actors, companies, foundations, megacities and citizens movements, which is something we didn't hear about from the speakers. There's a role of the private sector moving forward. What is that going to be within the humanitarian space? And I think it's going to be significant, especially when if we look at localised responses, you look at local private organisations being more involved in those sorts of things. And the fourth one is a revolution. Localised crises remain, non-traditional actors are gaining importance, all of those ones that I just mentioned. New regulations are developed as required on specific causes, women's rights, etc., to adapt to the arrival of new actors and new ways of working. Principles, the solid foundation of humanitarian principles is well and truly compromised. And the implications for NGOs in this is the scenario presents an opportunity to use influence and expertise to shape a new humanitarian system would be an interesting thing. Personally, I cannot see NGOs being involved in that. They have too much of a vested interest at the moment in maintaining the status quo. And NGOs will have to maintain their value add to maintain relevance. So they're the four things. The report, and I've had the opportunity to read the report as one of the reviewers, then goes into 5 different things that NGOs can do to make the changes that will be necessary for that. And coming out of those are things like partnerships, crucial, relationships, crucial, being able to, and Natalie, you were talking about being trauma-informed programming. That all takes a foresight that currently isn't there. People are locked into, and what I heard from each of the speakers are people are locked into their sectors, into their expertise, and they can't see outside of it. MSF and WHO can't even agree on how to take off a pair of goggles. They're the sorts of things that are going to bind the system and are currently binding the system and making it moribund. What we need is strategic foresight. We need to be able to think what the possible futures are, how might organisations and NGOs, particularly out of this report, then think through those scenarios and how might they need to work differently to achieve the outcomes that they may want to achieve. A little story, and Beth would know about this. The Humanitarian Leadership Program, and this is not an ad, we did some work, some research on this after the Haiyan response in 2014. We were in the Philippines looking at what the people had learned. We had 30 people that involved in that, had been through the leadership program, and one of the HR people, and HR was crucial, as was mentioned before by Emma, I believe, one of the HR people that was a local person and one of the few local people on the response team. And she said, it's really interesting. We can tell the people who are leading the response that have done the leadership program because they are more culturally aware. They engage both the development staff, the long-term development staff that were working in the office upstairs, as well as the humanitarian response team that was working downstairs. So it was engaging those. They could work across and think differently because they took a balcony view. They were able to step back and take a strategic view and not get caught in the day-to-day. Again, that is a micro form of foresight. But what we need to do is to be able to take that balcony view when we're not in a crisis and look beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I would like to throw open the floor to questions. Our fabulous Beck has a microphone and I can see many hands flung up already.
Hello, my name's Elliot. I was wondering to hear some of your reflections on attempts at collaboration through elements such as the cluster approach to emergencies.
I love the cluster approach. I do. I think the cluster approach is not perfect. Having rolled out the cluster approach in both Liberia and Afghanistan at the sort of earlier days of humanitarian reform, I saw some big changes. And I think, whilst being an imperfect system and approach, the fact that it got people around the table who had never met each other before from the various different sectors was invaluable. The fact that now advocacy is done by clusters. A cluster is a sector, so a shelter cluster, so for people who may be unfamiliar with the approach. And I think the predictability that has allowed a response to have when the cluster approach is activated has been very positive. I think the weaknesses of the system are around national organisations not being able to be as involved as they could be, but it is very resource intensive for organisations to send warm bodies to so many meetings. And also they're often not conducted in the local language, so that's problematic. And ensuring that clusters are replicated, not just they need to be at the national level, but also provincial and sometimes sub-provincial levels as well. But I really think that something had to change, and although it's imperfect, I think it's a step in the right direction. And for those organisations that operate outside the cluster, I think that also provides some redundancy in the system. So it's not bad that it's not a catch-all for everybody, but I do think that it's a step in the right direction.
I just want to respond to that question as well, because I agree. I think that it does create a level of predictability, and it certainly allows everyone to know where they stand when the clusters are activated. You know that you're going to have a certain types of sectors available, and you know which sector you're in. So for child protection, you know that you're going to have a child protection subcluster, even though you might still have to fight for a piece of the pie. You actually have part of that already paved out for you, which wasn't there before. The problem that I see is that it's not used in all situations. So where, for example, the Pacific, which is going to have a lot of emergencies over the next 10 to 20 years, because of the population size, it's not automatically activated. And so you'll have people that are coming from bigger emergencies who automatically assume the cluster system is going to be activated, and it's not. And then the other complication is in refugee settings, which is still in the 1933 situation of UNHCR doing their own system, and that can change depending on where you are. So again, in every refugee setting, you have to advocate for what sectors, because they won't call them clusters, have to be used. So it's great where it's used, and then and obviously there still needs to be improvements. The other area of it that needs to be improved is the preparedness component, because quite often OCHA isn't on the ground in places that don't have emergencies all the time or don't have chronic emergencies, so they come in after an emergency or just as the emergency is about to happen. So the rapid response isn't necessarily there. The assessment forms aren't developed. So little clusters like the child protection cluster, we won't even get a question in the interagency rapid assessment. So that can make it very difficult for some of us. And then you've got outsiders coming in and not knowing what is going on the ground, what's existing, and that cultural competence is missing then.
Hi, this question's mostly directed to Ian, just about what you think the military and the humanitarian sector can learn from each other in peacekeeping operations.
In peacekeeping operations? Sorry, 40 years, my hearing's not that great, so...
Sorry, what do you think the military and the humanitarian sector should learn from one another in peacekeeping operations?
Okay. Again, I think a lot of, the military is a very structured organisation. It doesn't matter which country you come from, it's based on discipline and different effects of training, and it's all about adult training and reaction to activities. So it's a lot of the things we do is a action-reaction, okay? So discipline there. The aim is to get in and get out, achieve the mission and leave as quickly as you can. So I guess the difference between the humanitarian sector and the military in a peacekeeping operation is that the military will try and establish a mission within an area of operations and complete it. However, United Nations operations don't work that way. If you think about DRC, for example, they've been in there a long time. So what the military can do for and with the humanitarians is to provide them support in the form of transport. They can create safe havens in support of the humanitarian sector and requirements. They can provide convoy escort. They can provide the repetitive planning that occurs in a DPKO headquarters in a joint JMAC problem with the army is we use a lot of acronyms, and it's hard to remember. Joint Military Missions Analysis Centre, which is largely run by civilians, but it has a large complement of military in there to assist. So there's a number of areas of complementarity between the two. One of the things I think, which is very important, has been mentioned a number of times, is culture. And the military have to understand the humanitarians' culture and vice versa. And that's an important part of our pre-deployment training, certainly in the Australian Defence Force. Very critical. Does that help? Thanks.
And I would just add that I think already some progress has been made. There is a specific role within humanitarian emergency response called CivMil, which is civilian military coordination. As military responders have over the decades been increasingly used as part of the first response to work alongside the humanitarians and local, like international humanitarian responders and local response, the need was very quickly identified for that cultural link, because military have their own language, humanitarians have their own language, and there's a strong likelihood that neither are really speaking the local language. During TC-PAM, the National Disaster Management Office was obviously coordinating the response out of Vanuatu, and there was a significant military presence there. But the NDMO, the head chief officer of the NDMO, said the most important person on the ground for him was the CivMil coordinator, because he said, in reality, it meant I didn't have to speak to Khaki. Now, it's not because he didn't like the military, but there was somebody whose job it was, who understood military, to talk to them about logistics, planning, projects, all of the things they were doing, and then be able to go to this officer who was representing the government and coordinating the government of Vanuatu and say, okay, this is what they can do for you, this is how it will happen, da-da-da, now what do you need from... And so this person was very literally going to and fro, and so it's a really crucial role, and I think... certainly from our perspective as an organisation, it's a role that will be in increasing demand as the role of military is perhaps expanded. And it's certainly particularly important when multiple military actors are on the ground. So Vanuatu was actually a fairly straightforward and simple response, but if you look at the Nepal response, which had, Indian military, French, German, English, so that then becomes another crucial point in terms of coordination and the ability to liaise and speak a common language.
Emma, you talked about the kind of problems that exist with large international humanitarian organisations and how their kind of egos operate. And then two other speakers are both talking about the need for innovation and the ability to think strategically. Does the panel feel that the kind of stale nature that was mentioned might inhibit that? And whether or not we should kind of give up on that structure and empower a whole new generation of young people to kind of question the way in which the sphere works? Or is it possible to kind of reform those agencies so that they can effectively more take on kind of strategic ways and more forward-thinking ways of dealing with major disasters? So the kind of crux of the question is the current setup with very large organisations like the WHO and the UN capable of taking on this kind of strategic advice, given that you have talked about its problems with doing that, say, in the West African Ebola crisis? Or, can it be reformed? Or do you need to empower a generation of young people to more actively question it? Or is it a bit of both?
The answer to that question kind of depends what day it is. Post-Ebola, WHO went through a massive reflection process because they knew that it hadn't gone well. Now, it'd be really interesting to go back and say, well, you went through that process, but what has actually changed? I was at a lessons learned DFAT-run workshop after PAM, and we were saying, we're not going to call it lessons learned anymore, we're going to call it lessons observed, because we saw what we did wrong, but it's actually too hard to change it for next time. So I think there is a will to change, and I don't think people are deluded, or I don't think people are trying to hide mistakes, but it's about how you affect change in these massive institutions, which, as Phil said, they were established on the wave of the Second World War with all of that inherent culture, that post-colonial, very didactic, top-down power structures and things. So it's very hard for them to change because they're quite entrenched. But innovation and innovative partnerships, the collaborations between IKEA and UNHCR, discussions with Coca-Cola and UNICEF around WASH, while they may fill your heart with horror at the thought of, really, we want Coca-Cola involved in water? Well, I think with that, you know, we have to accept that change is going to happen slowly, perhaps, and we have to be open to models that traditionally we might be a little bit cynical about. And that probably includes greater and better understanding of the role of military, which may, again, in our hearts, might seem not to sit well, ethically or morally, or, you know, again, commercially, with Coca-Cola again. But if we don't look for alternate models or different options around models, we can't just expect these institutions to just change without there being some other drivers, I would say.
Can I just, I'll just take up on that as well. Look, the last 6 years I was in the Australian Public Service. My job was to collect lessons from deployed Australian forces overseas, not the Special Forces, the other side. We don't, when I say we, generally we don't learn in large organisations. They're not lessons learned, they're lessons identified, and there might be observations that are put into practice. The United Nations is a large, slow-moving behemoth. They are very slow because of the inherent bureaucratic processes, and I won't be as kind about the UN and the people they recruit, who are very, very good at their jobs, but often are not very flexible to think outside their own lane. Not their fault. It's just a fact of life. The UN does make some progress, and this is a peacekeeping side of the house, totally away from humanitarian. DRC has been a nasty place, and is the largest operation in the world, with 19,000 odd soldiers and police and observers and then civilian staff, taking up to about 23,000 people. The UN were ineffective in the military role in a peacekeeping operation until 2014, when a decision was made that blue helmets could actually take direct action against enemy to stop them harming the civilian population. They call it the Intervention Brigade, much to the chagrin of many people in the United Nations and the world, that the UN was actually going to do something. And they very effectively attacked using some well-trained forces, and were effective in bringing the bad guys to the table, and they surrendered. So they can make change, but it's never going to be wholesale. It's going to be, just a scintilla, and often that may be turned around at some other stage. So if you're after a job in the United Nations, when you finish this course, go and join it. You can be there till 55, 60, get a great pension, and I know that you'll actually achieve a lot of things personally, but in some cases you might think to yourself afterwards, what have I actually achieved in that long period of time?
Being an ex-United Nations staff that did resign, I just want to say something positive. There is a lot of positive things that the United Nations does. And I was the Chief of Child Protection for UNICEF in the Philippines for a number of years, and I was the Chief of Child Protection in a number of states in Sudan, and I worked for UNICEF since 2004. And while it can be a slow-moving beast, it can be a bit like an elephant. When an elephant starts to run, it's a bit slow, but once it gets started, it can be very effective. And I know that every day that it does amazing things, and certainly I think the organisations on the ground do amazing things. I think we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. These organisations are human because we're human. And if you want the mechanism to work, you need to know how that car works. Basically, you need to become a mechanic of the organisation that you're working for. So when you're a consultant like I am now, you can go into an organisation and it might take you a little bit too long to work out how something works, like your example in Ebola. When you're actually in the institution, if you can spend your time also working out what forms you need to fill out and what templates there are and which person you need to become best friends with. The supply guy has got to be your best friend. The head of operations has to be your best friend. The head of security has to be your best friend, particularly if you're in child protection where you need to go to armed conflict areas. And whether you would like them normally, in a normal situation or not, does not matter. They need to become your best friend, and you need to be an expert. You need to get a PhD in human interactions, and that's how you make it work. I mean, we have moved mountains in child protection in so many countries. We've changed child protection systems. In Myanmar, they didn't even have a social work degree, and I worked with RMIT at that time, and we now have a diploma of social work there. And then when the big emergency occurred there, all of the social workers that we were training were the ones that have been hired. We did a small systems building in South Kordofan, and it cost only $12,000 to get all of these social workers trained and things. That is the only system that's working in South Kordofan right now. Health, nutrition, WASH are all using our social welfare officers to deliver aid. Now, they're not hired by the government anymore, but they're still there. So whilst mistakes can be made, I think if you... A lecturer once said to me, the best thing you can do is put yourself out of a job. And if you keep that in mind with every interaction you do in an emergency, and you are intending to build back better, your intentions will be left there, and you will make waves that you won't even hear about until decades later when someone comes up to you and goes, "Did you do that?" I mean, that happens all the time, and it's extraordinary. It sends chills down your spine because you think you stuffed something up. You come home thinking, I didn't do very well in that project, I left something behind, but you know, you often leave positive things behind that you don't realise, and sometimes it's just relationships.
I'll just add very quickly, I just had to get in that very quickly. The system has recognised it needs to change, which is why we had the World Humanitarian Summit last year. That's right, and the transformative agenda, absolutely, and having that senior implementation team who are leading that. We need to hold people to account for the commitments that they've made. The commitments have been made publicly. You can go and look at what people have committed to. The Australian government, what they have committed to on this agenda. So we need to hold them accountable for that. Everyone needs to be held accountable. And I will let Ian off the hook for using innovation around the word partnership. Because partnerships are not a contract. We keep crapping on about, oh, we have a partnership. No, you have a contractual agreement. Partnerships are something very different from that, and we shouldn't bandy that word around. And I agree, if we talk about innovative partnerships, which are something fundamentally different, then perhaps we might go in the right direction.
We'll take the one last question.
This is a question directed at Ian as well. Conventionally, military is Army, Air Force, Navy. Is there scope for a fourth sector military disaster response, given the military's obvious logistics expertise? A completely separate new division.
That is a great question. From my perspective, I think it's a wonderful idea. And you know, if you look at the American Defence Force, for example, the United States Marine Corps, they react all the time to humanitarian events and disaster relief, and they do it very well. I mean, they're locked and loaded, their ships are full of these resources, and they go and do the job, and they get out. I'm not aware of any plan in any country that I can think of that is looking at that, but you know, I guess if you take the UK stabilisation model or the Australian Civilian Corps model, where the aim was to identify people who had skill sets, not military, but, you know, lawyers and doctors and nurses and military and engineers, to call on them at short notice to react to help outside of a uniformed reaction in support of humanitarianism, I think that's a great model. But as I say, I'm not aware of any country that's contemplating that at the moment.
Thank you very much. Before I invite you to thank the panel one last time, a few short advertisements. We are having a book launch on the 25th of July. There's a flyer out by the door, a couple of books produced from within global studies at RMIT, a very exciting moment in which Senator Penny Wong is going to come and launch those books, so please join us for that event. Please also join us again on the 24th of August for our next Global Friction Seminar, which is on counting violence, the implications of quantification for policy and practice on gendered violence. And finally, for those of you who have a keen passion in this area, please stay in contact with us in the Centre for Global Research, because we do interesting things, we're doing interesting research, and we have fabulous programs, both postgraduate and undergraduate, that we'd be very happy to talk to you about. And Beck will put you in contact with me if you get in contact with the centre. And finally, thank you to our inspiring panel. I hope that now you understand why so many of us are so inspired and very pleased to have them in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.